Welcome to the end. Things are winding down for us here. And so I want to take just a few minutes to kind of touch base on where we're headed over the next couple of weeks. And I will mention while I'm getting this pulled up, I went back last night and did some catch-up grading. I graded the personal care routines lab assignment, and I received an email related to that apparently the due date online was a mistake there. It was left over from a previous semester, still saying that it was due in September. So I think there may have been some confusion among people as to when that was due. I will accept those after the fact. And so there's a video posted I'm trying to find it, week 8 on the course page. The personal care routine lab assignment, embedded within that is a video from Lucy Brock, where the teachers are facilitating a personal care routine in the infant toddler classroom. And then you would complete that personal care lab assignment related to watching that video. So hopefully that, and I can send an email to the same effect just to make sure that everyone's on the same page with that. But if for some reason you neglected to turn that in, and there were several who did not, go back and get that turned in before the end of the semester, and it'll be included in your grade as if it were not a missed assignment. I apologize for the confusion there. So that's the first order of business. And then today I want to spend our time kind of following up on what you all did asynchronously last week, looking at trauma and resiliency and things like that. And then today we're going to talk about guidance and how it's related to early childhood classroom curriculum. And I just want to point out that from here on, you have asynchronous work in the form of quizzes. So you have quiz 9 that's due before 2 p.m. on Thursday of this week. And then quiz 10 will follow that same pattern next week. That is kind of the end of what you have due, other than those 4 Lucy Brock lab component pieces. And then we will be approaching the final. And the final exam, there's a review already posted. That will be the only work for our last week of classes. And as you can see on the course page, the final is going to open up on Monday, April 25th at 8 o'clock in the morning. It will stay available to you online through Monday, May 2nd. So you will have a full week to complete that, with the understanding that you have a 2-hour time block. So you cannot come back in and out of the final. You need to make sure that you carve out a 2-hour chunk of time for you to sit and do that all in one session. But it will be online for a week for you to do at your convenience. Any questions?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Go back and say what you said earlier. My Wi-Fi was giving me trouble, so I came in on the end of you talking about the personal care lab. I'm sorry, can you do that really quick?
Yeah, no problem. So personal care lab was posted to week 8. It was due right before the midterm, but apparently how I had it posted online, it stated that it was due in September from a previous semester. So there was some confusion about that. So if you did not submit that, you can go back in. If you click this link under week 8, there's a video for you to watch of the teachers at Lucy Brock facilitating a personal care routine, and then you complete the lab assignment accordingly.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I just wanted to clarify.
Yep, no problem. Any other questions about any of this that we've just touched base on? Is everyone successfully getting their time in at Lucy Brock and having a good experience, I hope, with that? Okay. All right, so if we could take just a few minutes for people who are willing to share kind of standout information, take home message from last week with the ACEs presentation, and then the podcast that you were to listen to related to COVID specifically, and trauma and resiliency. You can unmute yourself and share, or if you want to use the chat feature, just kind of hit the highlights. And I had the ACEs PowerPoint pulled up so that we could look at that kind of together for some talking points as well. Can you all see that? Okay. So someone tell us what are ACEs.
Adverse childhood experiences. Oh, sorry.
Thank you both. And what are some examples of adverse childhood experiences then? This slide right here, where it says abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, it kind of gives us a nice visual. It can be abuse physically, emotionally, sexually, neglect in the form of emotional or physical neglect. And then they use this term household dysfunction to kind of catch substance use and abuse, divorce in the family, violent treatment of a family member. It says mother treated violently, but I would like to say that fathers can also be treated violently, and violence in the home is an adverse childhood experience. Incarcerated relatives, and then mental illness of a family member. So all of those are kind of a glimpse at adverse childhood experiences. And then why are we in an early childhood guidance course? Why are we talking about adverse childhood experiences? Someone else mentioned living in poverty. Yeah, that's a great one that is not on that list. And food insecurity. And those are interesting because they typically, and we saw this in this presentation, right, that they're sort of these comorbid experiences. They often go hand in hand with other adverse childhood experiences. And families living in extreme poverty, food insecurity, those parents are often under an extreme amount of pressure. And so that may result in substance use and abuse, violence in the home, and those other type of things can be very related, not necessarily have to be, but they certainly can be. So people are saying the reason that we're talking about them is because these adverse childhood experiences affect many aspects of our lives, both as young children as well as adults, right? So it's important now to kind of look back on what was my experience in childhood, and then how does that influence me? How do I bring that to the table in my work in this field today? And then also understanding where children and families are that we're working with. It directly influences children's development and their behavioral patterns correlated to lower levels of language and communication. And we saw in this presentation how all of this is related to brain development, right? Children who experience prolonged toxic levels of stress and ACEs, their brains actually develop differently to the point that they perceive the world differently than other children who do not share those experiences. And so it can show up in a lot of ways, like higher stress, lower levels of language and communication. And then the way that we respond to these children who sometimes present with really challenging behaviors as a result of their exposure to ACEs can actually, it can either help serve in a protective way to bolster child development, or it can have the opposite effect, right? And it can lead to further isolation and neglect, and further sort of snowballing of this trauma. Anybody got any other thoughts on what we've said so far? All right. And so some information was shared about community resources, right? And And then I think the main thing that I want you to understand is that sort of protective factor that early care and education can serve in this scenario. So understanding, you know, when we are working with children who come from these trauma backgrounds, that the approach that works for every child might not be the approach that works for these children in particular. They need a lot more empathic response. They need a lot, probably more of a gentle approach to child guidance, right? And then does anyone have anything they're willing to share from a podcast specific to the COVID information?
One of the things that both of the podcasts that I listened to talked about was how it's important for adults to take care of themselves during COVID so that they can help take care of their children, that it's like important for them to be secure and safe and confident so that they can help the kids.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You know, I feel like that's kind of a cliche that we hear a lot of times in this work, you know, self-care, so you can care for others or whatever. But it's really not cliche, you know, and I talk about it a lot in a lot of different contexts. But it's so easy to kind of let that go by the wayside. And it can be as simple as taking the time to sit out on the porch and drink a cup of coffee to yourself, especially if you think back to, you know, we're kind of, fingers crossed, emerging out of pandemic life, right? And things are shifting back to whatever normal now is. Again, I hope, but you know, when you think back to that time when we were all staying home, no one was, you know, outside of the house. And like in my case, and in the case of almost everyone, you know, in America at that time, we were home with young children, working, trying to do so many things. The amount of pressure and that level of uncertainty, you know, this goes back to what we were just talking about with living in poverty and things like that. That level of unknown and uncertainty creates this sense of chaos in our lives that, you know, is a stressor in and of itself. And so again, something as simple as taking a cup of coffee and having 5 or 10 minutes out on the porch in solitude can be the thing that really shifts your day as a parent, as a caretaker, and helps you kind of reset and then bring yourself back to the children that you're working with a kind of fresh perspective. And so I think outside of COVID, that message of caring for yourself so that you can care for other people is hugely important. And it was even more important, you know, during the height of the pandemic. Any other takeaways?
My Wi-Fi is being kind of weird, but so let me know.
Okay.
But I wrote down one thing that kind of stuck with me was being able to like acknowledge the small concerns that children have that maybe like you would have initially written off, and like why are you even thinking about that in the grand scheme of something like a pandemic? But for a child, these little concerns that they might be having, one of the examples given was like, oh, school is closing for like spring break, it's going to be longer, when's our homework going to be due? Sometimes they're not able to see like the big picture, but still being able to validate those feelings and realize that for them that can be a really big picture, and making sure to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and you know, we've talked about that idea all along, right? Is that children's feelings, first and foremost, need to be acknowledged. They need to be validated because we don't know what their experience is. And it's not our place ever in life with children or adults to tell someone how they should feel about a circumstance, right? Our work is to acknowledge, to validate, I hear you, that that's how you're feeling, and then to help problem solve around, you know, what might be coming next, or how you might manage that uncertainty of when is this going to be due, or whatever the situation is. But I think that validation piece is And that's, directly related to child guidance, right? It's one of those kind of fundamental principles that this is how we relate to children and other people, first and foremost. And all of this work that we're talking about in this course has to be done in the context of those relationships. So I think that's, again, a lot of these things became even more important kind of at the height of the pandemic, but they're principles that are important all the time. Any other before we move on? What Delaney just mentioned reminds me of, I have a colleague in my doctoral program who is doing research on children's worries. And so they're interviewing children like kindergarten to 5th grade and looking at the things that children worry about. And hearing her share the children's language and experiences has brought me to tears on more than one occasion, because, you don't think, one little fellow put his hands back behind his head, she said, and he said, "Oh, I hope you have a long time to listen," a 3rd grader. And it's just like, you don't realize that children, and that's just, I don't think we honor that enough and give children a safe space to kind of share those thoughts and feelings. And it has become, I don't think we will know for years to come kind of the implications and the long-term impacts that we have all collectively gone through in the past few years will have on us, and in particular on our children who, their whole world was kind of shifted on, well, all of our worlds were shifted. But I think, we have resources and coping mechanisms that young children don't have access to. So anyways, things to be mindful of as you were, working in whatever capacity you find yourself working with children. I think all of what was discussed last week is really critical stuff. So shifting gears now to talk about guidance and curriculum and how these are really interconnected, interrelated. You cannot talk about curriculum in the early childhood setting without having some understanding of child guidance, and child guidance shows up in early childhood curriculum. So they're very, very much connected and related to one another. We're going to talk specifically about different domains of development, again, with the understanding that all learning in the early childhood setting is very interconnected and integrated. But we do know that, things like art, language arts, science, math, the learning domains are kind of broken out for the sake of conversation and understanding. And so we'll talk about each of those and developmentally appropriate expectations and experiences for children. And then we'll talk some about strategies of guidance that relate to, learning in the different areas. So this might be our final look at this pyramid that has haunted us all semester. But the pyramid, again, we're talking about these foundational pieces that have to be in place as a way to support children indirectly. And you can see here, we spent some time talking about environment early on in the semester, closely connected to that in the pyramid as a form of indirect guidance, or those things that happen behind the scenes to set children up for success in the classroom, right, is a curriculum, both indoors and outdoors, that engages the whole child. And the thinking here is that if you have appropriate expectations, quality environments, and engaging curriculum at the bottom, then you will spend less time up here trying to facilitate positive behavior and responding to challenging behavior. Just to kind of quickly give a definition of what is curriculum in the early childhood classroom, it's the processes that children go through to achieve identified learning goals. We will talk in a minute about this textbook foundations for early learning and development. It's lovingly referred to as the FELDS. And I assume that at this point in your careers, you all have some working knowledge of what this book is. Yes. But our curriculum should align in some way, shape, or form with the foundations for early learning that the state of North Carolina has set forth. And so curriculum can also define what teachers do to help children go through these processes. And that includes experiences, materials, conversations. And then curriculum can also refer to the context in which teaching and learning occur. So a lot of times in the infant toddler setting, we talk specifically about routine as curriculum, right? That's the context within which teaching and learning occur. And so when we are working with an infant, singing a song to them as we change their diaper on the diaper changer, that can be considered early childhood curriculum if it's intentional and done in a way that supports identified goals for infants and toddlers. And then, as I mentioned, early childhood curriculum is integrated so that it addresses that whole child. It's not, today we're doing science, but as we're doing some sort of science related experience, we are also making sure we're working on fine motor goals, social and emotional goals, language goals. You guys know this. And an integrated curriculum should take a strengths-based approach and an interest-based approach. So we want to be meeting children where they are developmentally and making sure that we are bolstering development in an appropriate way from where children currently are. And so using my example of like toileting routines in the infant toddler setting, it doesn't make any sense and it's not developmentally appropriate to say this child is turning 2, it's time to start toilet training. Rather, we would look for signs of readiness, signs of interest, all of those things that are showing us that is where the child is in their trajectory of development. And then we could support that in our classroom and in our interactions with families and things like that. And that interest-based piece, I think it's important all along, but it becomes much more important as children kind of grow through an early childhood program. Preschool curriculum should be very closely related to observations of young children, what we hear the children talking about, what we notice them doing in their natural free play in high quality centers in the classroom. So these the circles outside of the heart are the domains that are broken out in the foundations text, right? Approaches to play and learning is one of them. Social and emotional development, health and physical development, language development and communication, and then cognitive development. I think most of these are pretty straightforward, and I'll just speak to that approaches to play and learning. This is really where we're looking at curiosity, wonder, disposition towards learning, right? So an interest in engaging in materials and an interest in being an active participant in the classroom. But again, each of these, it's a kind of an isolated domain of learning and development, but we know that activities are integrated, right? So here's an example of an integrated activity. After tracing an outline of their very tall teacher, a group of 3 to 5-year-olds names it the big body, and they watch intently as their teacher fastens the drawing to the wall. When asked what they needed to do next, the children shouted, "Make the insides!" And they spent the next several weeks using yarn, makers, drinking straws, sticks, scissors, hole punchers, and other materials to create the insides of this body. They included veins, blood cells, a heart, bones, facial features, hair, glasses, and a grinder in the stomach area for digesting food. The children asked a ton of questions. They had numerous discussions about different body parts, including their own names, original names that they came up with. And they hypothesized what different parts of the body did and negotiated how to best use materials to construct this life-sized body. They had to do some problem solving when some pieces of their body fell off, and figure out how to get them to reaffix. And they ended up eventually doing this dramatic play with the body where they had a broken arm, a broken heart, and orders to return every day for 24 days on a handwritten doctor's note, right? So talk to me about the things in terms of learning activities. What did you just hear coming out of that example of an integrated activity? You can use the chat or talk out loud. On the surface, it's kind of like an art activity, right? Putting together this big body representation project. But then we also heard coming out of that, obviously, language, science learning related to health and the body, problem solving, that's social and emotional, dramatic play at the end when they were pretending that there were broken pieces and writing prescriptions and things like that. So you can see just in this one example how lots of things are happening that relate to and support early childhood curriculum. This slide really kind of helps us understand how guidance and curriculum are interrelated. So children, you know, kind of the bottom line here is that children who are highly engaged in the classroom, if they're working, thinking, you know, playing in a way that is truly meaningful, they're less likely to be engaged in misbehavior, right? They're going to spend their energy in the classroom in a more constructive way. So good curriculum, classroom curriculum that supports that type of engagement, supports guidance, and that guidance, direct guidance, has to happen less often. And then guidance supports curriculum in that, you know, you can't foster learning in a classroom without that social and emotional piece that we know is so foundational to children being successful. So we use indirect guidance to promote self-directed discovery and exploration in the classroom. And then we use direct guidance to help children, you know, communicate more effectively with one another, and also to understand learning content more accurately in the classroom. Someone have a question? So this developmental perspective, excuse me, this basically tells us that children develop, and we all know this, right? Children develop at their own pace and in their own sort of time frame, but all children develop according to this predictable sequence or trajectory of development. So it's children's development is always going to follow a predictable pattern, and we always see children going from this bigger picture, broader piece of development, and then eventually refining things down. It's the same thing as, you know, when the child learns to do a palmar grasp on a crayon and they scribble across a huge piece of paper. That's the generalized global effort. And then eventually over the course of a couple of years, we see that palmar grasp shift to a pincher grasp, and children are able to do more focused lines and approximations of letters and things like that. You know, with language, it's the trajectory of babbling, making verbalizations, to engaging in meaningful conversation. But understanding that developmental perspective is hugely important in terms of thinking about how we provide materials and activities and experiences that support children's growth and development. So I talked about FELDS, briefly before, but at the same time that it's important to make sure that we are drawing on the research that was put into writing this book so that we understand what should children at these different age groups. And this text is broken out it's not really specific to ages. It just refers to children as younger infants, younger toddlers, older toddlers, younger preschoolers, older preschoolers. And that's really the most appropriate way to kind of conceptualize children in these different age brackets, because again, it's very artificial to say at 18 months, a child should be doing this, 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 and this. Those are all just kind of like loose guidelines. But the ultimate goal of these goals is that we want to see children coming out of early childhood programs and then out of the education system at large, who are well-adjusted, self-directed, productive members of society, right? That's kind of the intent of all of our work. So keeping that in mind as we look at what are goals for art experiences for children. Now we're going to kind of look at each different kind of learning area that we typically see in the early childhood classroom. At the most basic level, what we're trying to work on through art with young children is hand-eye coordination, sensory exploration, and then some basic understanding of colors, shapes, things like that, right? And so that's what you're going to see in the infant, toddler, early preschool realm. And then as children grow and progress, we would like to see them developing a relationship with materials like paint, clay, 3D art, so that they can use these media as a way to communicate and create meaning around the things that they experience in their day-to-day. It's a very Reggio-inspired approach to talk about the languages of children, and understanding that children can represent their thinking and their knowledge through a variety of ways, art materials being one of those ways or one of those languages. We also want to help children develop like an appreciation for the aesthetic, right? So sometimes design elements, showing children real art, all of that can help children develop this appreciation of beautiful things. And then there's also problem solving and perspective taking that can come out of art experiences for children. Anything to add to that? Thinking about language and literacy, this term emergent literacy is important to kind of note because this is the term that is used to talk about children's knowledge of reading and writing before they actually learn how to read and write. So it encompasses like book awareness, holding a book and orienting it in the right way, understanding even that we use a symbol system to communicate through, written form. All of that sort of foundational pre-literacy stuff is referred to now as emergent literacy. And then, the goals of literacy in the early childhood classroom are obviously to develop phonological awareness, which is hearing sounds and rhythms of speech. We want children to be familiar with print awareness, and then also starting to develop alphabet knowledge where they make connections between the symbols and their letters and their sounds. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is enhance children's ability and increase their desire to understand and use oral and written language, right? And so I think authentic experiences with literacy, having children write their name on things in meaningful ways, reading books that are closely connected to topics of interest in the classroom. All of those are ways to promote that desire to use language in a meaningful way. The same thing kind of goes for math. You know, math is another symbol system. There's a theorist named Constance Camille. She did a lot of work based on Piaget's original work. And she talks about this idea that teaching number is impossible. And she really kind of unpacks how children experience numeracy. And it's through like manipulation of items and number in their environment, that we can't really teach children to do math. We have to let them sort of experience math. And again, we have these foundational goals related to concept of number, one-to-one correspondence, sorting and counting, and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, what we want children to do is have confidence in their ability to work with math and numbers, and a willingness to do this work. Science learning. This can happen in the form of life science in the classroom, you know, so characteristics of living things. Right now, my girls and I are hatching painted lady butterflies that we've watched grow from these little kind of gross, like worm things. And now they're fat, juicy caterpillars. And hopefully in the next couple of days, they're going to put themselves into their chrysalises. But my 7-year-old has written a book where we've charted their growth, and, you know, we've been taking pictures along the way. All of that can be done in the preschool setting, you know, with support from a teacher, but that's life science happening in the classroom. You can do physical science where you're looking at properties of objects. I don't know if you all have seen them at Lucy Brock using the Ramps and Pathways curriculum, but Ramps and Pathways is a really important piece of the early childhood curriculum to help children understand things like weight, velocity, speed, shape, you know, all of those. What you do is put different shaped materials on these pieces of cove molding and let children experience how they roll and how they move at different speeds. Of course, you can bring in earth and space science, science and technology. And then one that maybe isn't so obvious is like science and social perspectives. So teaching children about sustainability, recycling, all of those things that help us be good stewards of our earth are also really important. So would anyone be willing to share what types of activities you have observed during your participation at Lucy Brock, and how this relates back to these goals for classroom experiences that we've just touched on? No one has seen anything of interest going on, huh?
Most of the time when I go there, they're like in the outdoor area.
Mm.
So I would say like they have a sandbox, which is kind of like science, like exploring like outdoors or just like being outdoors, I guess. With science, like they'll like look at the trees or like, oh, look at, like they'll explore nature outside and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think, Megan, thank you for that. That brings me to an important point that it's actually much more meaningful and richer for children to observe like natural science that's kind of happening all around them. I mean, right now, think about last week when it was snowing and then the next day it was 60 degrees and sunny. Like we have a lot happening just in our natural environment that we can observe, we can talk about, we can research. And that is so much more impactful than like the vinegar and baking soda volcano, you know, because to children that it's not rooted in their day-to-day experience, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so that, you know, they're not at a level where they can understand those. I don't even know if I'm at a level where I can understand the scientific reactions or whatever that are happening to cause that kind of thing. So it's so much richer to just take, you know, like things that are happening outdoors in the natural environment. And sand, water in the classroom, all of those kind of sensory experiences, they can be related to art, but they can also be very closely related to science because of those physical properties of objects and how they interact with the physical properties of those sand and water type materials. Anyone else willing to share something that they've seen?
I've been at Cove Creek for my observations, and they have like a scale in the classroom, like where it has like the 2 buckets on either side, and you fill it up and see, you know, what weighs more, and like, you know, if you can balance the scale. And I was there a few weeks ago, and me and one of the kids, like, he's out there for almost 30 minutes just like messing around with all the different stuff around him, like seeing like how he could balance it. And it was just really cool to like see how excited he got when he would balance it, or like when something would be like super duper heavy that he thought wasn't going to be as heavy as it was. So it was cool to see him explore that.
Yeah, and so that is an example of science learning, also math skills. You know, the scale itself is a form of technology, albeit kind of old school technology at this point. But and then that sort of going around and finding things that might be heavier than you expected, that's a social and emotional piece, right, of being an explorer and being a curious learner. And so again, you know, an example of how multiple learning domains are being kind of activated in just that simple play experience. So looking specifically then at how we guide child-directed activities in the classroom. When children are naturally at play, we can use these 3 forms of guidance as a way to support that play. Affective guidance, which looks like noticing and encouraging children's work. Again, I said encourage rather than praise. So it's that idea of, wow, you're working so hard to find things in our classroom that weigh more than the, you know, whatever you put on the other side of the scale. And then acknowledging and validating children's feelings as they're at work and at play. Physical guidance. Oftentimes this just means proximity in the classroom, right? So if you see a group of 6 boys, and I'm saying boys, but I should open that up to boys and girls, 6 people in the early childhood classroom gravitating toward the block center, that would be my cue to move my body over towards the block center, because number one, you know, 6 children likely maybe are going to need some support in terms of negotiating and navigating conflict in their play, or sharing materials or whatever. And then, you know, block center, housekeeping, those kind of big body play areas tend to be a sign that someone needs to be close enough to this 3rd bullet point, avoid interfering too quickly or too much, but to be there in case interference is warranted. And so you want to make sure that you're noticing as you're playing in the classroom, or as you're, you know, supporting the classroom, noticing where children are and where play might need teacher physical guidance, even just in the form of a big body close by. And then verbal guidance can look like commenting on what you see the children doing. Oftentimes when I'm working with young children, I do this with my own kids at home. I just sort of narrate like what I'm doing, my own thought processes, and I narrate what I see them doing sometimes. And again, it gives them more language, and it helps them kind of hear that verbalization of maybe your own thought processes or their thought processes, so that they can more deeply understand their own play and work. And I think this last point is really important, because we want this to feel just like everything else in the early childhood classroom. We want this to feel authentic, right? It's not like, oh, what color is that block that you're putting up there? How many blocks did you stack? Those are kind of more like skill and drill type of ways to engage with children, where you're trying to work on, you know, color recognition or counting skills or whatever. To give an example of play in the block area, that would be real conversation. It's like, can you tell me more about, your idea here? Or something that is much more open-ended and kind of engages the child at a different level. And I'm not saying that there's not a place for teaching color and counting and all of that. There certainly is, but we want to make sure that we're doing more of this authentic, real talking with children. Any questions or thoughts on that idea? Has anybody ever been in a country where English was not the primary language, or had an experience where you were sort of submersed in this environment that didn't use your home language? It can be very uncomfortable, right? And very challenging to communicate with individuals who don't speak your native language. And so thinking about how we support English language learners is really important. And, basically the goal is to support them in developing language skills in English, but not to replace their home language. In fact, we would rather honor their home language and bring that into our classroom as much as we can. And then, I think this third point about focusing on the meaning versus correcting their grammar, pronunciation, things like that, that really applies to all children, in my opinion, but it's even more important for dual language learners. But we really just want to encourage communication on the part of the child. And so, Hannah, thanks for saying when she was in Mexico, she had that experience. And I'm sure that, it's challenging, and it will give you kind of that empathetic response to thinking about how children who are not primarily speaking English being immersed in a classroom that is, might have challenges related to that. But again, it's important to focus on these children's strengths, right? So they are actually getting a leg up on the other children in the classroom by doing this work of learning two languages simultaneously. And I think thinking about it as an asset and not a challenge is really important to how we interact with those children as well. A piece of the curriculum that could easily be overlooked is cleanup time. So teaching children how to take care of our environment and our space is a part of the early childhood curriculum, and should be done in a really supported way. So we've talked about transitions and cues to kind of help with this. The main thing that I want to mention here is that this is not work that we tell the children to do and then we kind of stand back and wait for them to do it successfully. This is work that we do with children, right? So we are modeling, this is how I take care of this space because I care about it as a community member that is also responsible for this space. And then when we get excited alongside children, they're much more apt to want to clean up the classroom when it's done in this kind of fun, playful way, and not like it's not supposed to be a negative experience, I am just going to let you guys access these learning stories on your own time. But basically, this is some examples of children dramatizing familiar childhood stories, and kind of thinking about then what are the skills that children are practicing, what are the benefits to this type of experience. And it's a literacy, language and literacy experience, but also very much social emotional and things like that. If we were together in person, we would be doing some of these activities a little more thoroughly. But since we're not, and we are in the virtual space. I'm just going to let you think about this on your own time, should you choose to do so. And so that brings us to the end of what I have today. And again, just be mindful that you have those 2 quizzes due and the lab participation assignments. And then we will be wrapping our time together up. Anybody have anything before we go?
I wanted to double check when we're going into the classroom, like obviously when we go to observe for other classes, we like sign in. There's no like sign in sheet that I'm missing, right?
No, when you are in the classroom doing your participation, the teachers are anticipating you being there. And yeah, everyone's typing their name into the chat if you'll go ahead and do that. And so if, based on that master calendar, if someone doesn't show up, I am made aware of that by Dr. Anderson. Yeah, but there's nothing to do besides go in and wash your hands and get
Okay.
ready. Any other questions? Yeah, you're welcome. All right. I am available by email if you need me. Otherwise, I will see you next week for our last class meeting. And then it's all downhill from there. Y'all have a nice week.
Thank you.
Mhm.